excavation feeds, picked archives, and restricted MuseumNet transcripts from independent archaeovists converge on a narrow set of anomalies discovered within the outer galleries of Solemnace. Survey drones returning from the tomb world recorded vitrified displays and vitrines sealed in older matrix fields, each exhibit annotated with timestamps that predate the reawakening cycles of nearby dynastic lords. Eyewitness reports from archivists and stray servitors detail tableaux in which entire living beings, soldiers, priests, xenos specimens, appear arrested at a single instant of motion, preserved in diorama-scale recreations of battles, rituals, and singular events. Forensic scans returned by Imperial salvage parties and freelance curators indicate not mere sculpture, but fields of temporal stasis and localized reality engineering around these exhibits, accompanied by glyphic inscriptions consistent with Nihilakh coding and with signatures occasionally matching one known Necron Overlord who claims stewardship of the Solemnace galleries, Trazyn the Infinite. Archaeological and Pictfeed records converge on a set of verifiable facts about Trazyn's domain and his declared purpose. He's identified in dynastic registers as an overlord of the Nihilakh dynasty, who assumed custodianship of a complex of galleries on the tomb world called Solemnace. The galleries, as described in recovered field reports, function as both repository and exhibition hall for artifacts ranging from mundane relics of long-dead cultures to items described in Imperial and Xenos histories as unique or irretrievably lost. These records are corroborated by multiple registry entries and by a modern narrative codex that places Trazyn in the role of self-appointed Archaeovist, a curator whose activities extend beyond collection into active preservation and, when necessary, retrieval. Contemporary codices and reference compendia record Trazyn's proclivity to obtain and entomb items and living specimens by force when expedient. The inventories attributed to his galleries include items whose authenticity and provenance have been independently verified by Imperial researchers, relics confirmed in human liturgical records, trophies whose iconography matches lost regimental descriptions, and even intact remains that forensic labs have dated to eras predating current Imperial history. Where Imperial custody has been possible, comparative analysis between Imperial archives and gallery exhibits often shows exact matches, sometimes down to tool marks, and where consistent with the original item's use. These correspondences lend weight to the assessment that Trazyn's holdings are not mere fabrications or reproductions, but, in many cases, original elements removed from their native contexts and preserved within a controlled matrix on Solemnace. Trazyn's documented public behaviour follows a recognisable pattern revealed in recovered tactical logs and narrative fiction that has itself been compiled from eyewitnesses who survived encounters with his retinues. He rarely leaves Solemnace without cause, and typically dispatches proxies or controlled detachments to retrieve specific items. When he appears in person, reports indicate a combination of diplomatic courtesy and ruthless acquisition strategy. Negotiations can occur, but are frequently accompanied by demonstrations of force or by the sudden appearance of immobilizing fields that render hostile parties inert and suitable for transport. Several short stories and official Black Library materials record incidents in which entire combatants were added to his displays following hostilities, frozen in their last pose. These incidents are described with consistent technical detail across different sources, including the mechanics of containment and the subsequent cataloguing of specimens. Known canon places Trazyn's most prominent narrative presence in a set of modern Necron short stories and a dedicated novel that expand the observational material available to researchers. These works situate him as an ancient construct originally born in the era when the Necrontyr underwent transference into undying bodies, a background shared by the wider Necron species. Canonical accounts identify his dynasty affiliation as Nihilakh, though sources emphasize his operational independence. He functions less as an administrative dynastic agent and more as a curator whose priorities are preservation and the expansion of his collections. The novel material and supporting short stories provide multiple corroborating incidents that are referenced in archival studies. thefts of artifacts from well-documented Imperial sites, the retrieval of rare xenos specimens, and the housing of items whose existence the wider galaxy believed to be fictional or destroyed. These canonical references are significant because they anchor many otherwise peripheral eyewitness claims to a reproducible literary corpus that researchers can analyze. Physical descriptions within the archives adhere to Necron morphology and the peculiarities of one who is both an overlord and a conservator. Field photographs and pict scans, often taken under duress during borrowings or salvage, depict a figure in regalia that combines ceremonial ornamentation with antiquarian accoutrements. Devices attached to his person serve dual roles, as tools of dominion in battle and as mechanisms of containment or induction when securing exhibits. Amongst these, the empathic obliterator is listed in equipment inventories as a unique staff attributed to Trazyn. Descriptions in recovered analysis logs credit the weapon with an unusual effect linked to neural or psionic resonance that can incapacitate or annihilate groups of similarly minded entities when employed in combat. Analysis teams note that entries describing the staff contain speculative cross-references to technologies older than recorded Necron engineering, what some sources identify as potential Old One's components, but such suggestions remain provisional and are treated as hypothesis rather than confirmed fact by formal archives. The provenance of Trazyn's earliest recorded possessions remains a matter of scholarly investigation, but follows the broader history of his species. He originated as a necrontier, a mortal physiognomy recorded in fragmentary archaeotexts and scattered pict glyphs. As with other necrontyr who underwent biotransference, the transfer into constructs effectively erased their biological pasts, leaving behind only formal records and the artifacts they chose to retain or accumulate. For Trazyn, early exhibit lists reconstructed from pict feeds imply an intellectual continuity. Items he sought often possess strong narrative or cultural value. Imperial intelligence summaries that scrutinized recovered exhibit logs infer that Trazyn's collecting behavior demonstrates an interest in moments of dramatic historical significance, turning points, cultural pinnacles, and objects that carry symbolic weight within the lore of other races. The implication for historians is that Trazyn selects objects not merely for rarity or power, but for their capacity to represent whole events. This motif supports the evidence collected from his galleries, where dioramas and preserved tableaux are assembled with an archival intent rather than mere trophy display. Cataloguing methodology used by those who have studied surviving pict feeds from Solemnace reveals a meticulous archival practice. Each acquisition appears to be accompanied by metadata inscriptions, origin coordinates when available, material composition, temporal approximations derived from isotopic analysis when permitted, and a curatorial notation that attempts to place the piece within an interspecies chronology. For items where provenance is ambiguous, the museum entries sometimes include preserved witness statements or translated fragments recovered from the artifact itself. Institutional historians compare these metadata patterns to other recorded Necron archival methods and find consistency in structure, suggesting a systematized approach to collection management that may predate the current configuration of the galleries. Instrumental readouts from salvage logs cite localized field harmonics unique to the Solemnace matrix, and those harmonics complicate efforts to dislodge items without destroying the integrity of their preservation fields. Consequently, many items remain in situ, accessible to researchers only via transmitted pic scans and telemetry. The earliest confirmed human encounters catalogued in Imperial reports occurred during exploratory missions and salvage operations, whose logs later surfaced through Imperial ordnance leaks and private archive releases. These initial encounters depict bewildered Imperial agents confronted by entire scenes of halted combat and ceremony, often finding within the galleries figures they could identify from long-lost registries. Where Imperial records overlap with pict feeds from the galleries, the same individual can appear in both datasets, a phenomenon that prompted a formal inquiry into the mechanics of preservation. The inquiry concluded that the galleries are not merely repositories of inert material, but are, in functional terms, controlled loci of arrested experience. specimens retain a form of localized situational integrity. Such a conclusion has significant implications, not least because it raises ethical and technical questions about retrieval and the responsibilities of those who would transfer items back to living custodians. Archives insist on rigorous protocols when attempting extraction, as the fields that preserve these exhibits are liable to collapse if tampered with incorrectly, leading to complete degradation of the entrapped relic and any contextual data. Forensic teams that have sampled the peripheries of Trazyn's galleries emphasize the scale of his operations. The Solemnace complex, as indicated in multiple reconnaissance maps, contains dozens of discrete halls, each devoted to a thematic collection. Some halls are devoted to specific wars, others to cultural practices or to species-specific exhibitions. Reconnaissance imagery shows that his galleries are arranged with a curatorial logic. Interstitial pathways allow for viewing from multiple vectors, and containment arrays are interwoven with communication relays that maintain exhibit stability even in the presence of external electromagnetic interference. Maintenance drones observed by boarding parties appear to follow strict schedules recorded within Necron ledger glyphs, indicating active curation rather than passive storage. Items that are mobile within their exhibits are often constrained by microfield anchors that present complex engineering challenges for removal. These structural features suggest that Trazyn does not merely collect. He engineers environments to hold narratives intact for study and display. The historical record, as assembled from canonical sources and corroborating field data, paints a portrait of a figure whose motives are complex but whose method is clear. Trazyn's activity has preserved artifacts and events that would otherwise be inaccessible, and his galleries supply scholars with rare data points about epochs and cultures whose direct records are sparse or destroyed. Simultaneously, his actions complicate broader ethical and strategic considerations. Objects of cultural patrimony, military intelligence, and even living beings have been removed from their native contexts and sequestered behind fields that resist recovery. Imperial analysts and independent curators weigh these competing values differently, but within academic circles it is accepted that Trazyn's galleries constitute both a treasure trove of primary material and a vexing challenge to established principles of provenance and restitution. The debate continues in closed conferences and in the marginalia of salvaged dossiers, where recovered exhibits are compared against Imperial records. Where gaps in the economic and political histories of affected systems persist, Trazyn's exhibits sometimes provide unexpected clarity. An example, drawn from comparative analysis of picked feeds and a recovered Imperial ledger, concerns the reconstruction of a localized uprising whose official records had been partially purged. The gallery exhibit contained participants, weaponry, and a preserved enactment that matched the fragmentary ledger entries, allowing historians to reconstruct a more complete account of the engagement. That reconstruction has since informed subsequent policy decisions in adjacent sectors. Such cases demonstrate the utilitarian value of the galleries for empirical historiography, even as debates rage about the legitimacy of the means by which such data were acquired. Archival ethics committees continue to evaluate whether the ends of historical preservation can justify the forcible removal of cultural artifacts by a non-human agent whose primary allegiance is to an aesthetic and mnemonic imperative, rather than to any external legal framework. The figure that emerges from the available primary material is therefore paradoxical. Trazyn represents an unparalleled repository of galactic history, a custodian whose collections allow for the reconstruction of lost narratives and the verification of disputed events. He is also an agent whose methods routinely breach the conventions of ownership and whose exhibits raise unresolved questions about agency, consent, and the custodial rights of living cultures. For historians and archaeovists, his galleries are simultaneously a resource and a provocation. They preserve what might otherwise be irretrievable, but they do so on terms negotiated by the collector alone. As such, the study of Trazyn's early activities requires not only technical analysis of his methods, but also philosophical consideration of the value and limits of preservation when opposed to autonomy and provenance. This part has established the documented archaeological and eyewitness foundations that ground inquiries into Trazyn's origins and early life. the material gathered from picked feeds, field logs, and canonical narratives provides the evidentiary basis for deeper examination of his formative history, his ascension to custodianship of the Solemnace galleries, and the cultural factors that shaped his collecting imperative. The subsequent sections will address those dimensions in greater detail, moving from observed museum practices toward the personal history and early affiliations that led to the consolidation of his collections and the reputation that follows his name. The figure known across multiple eras as Trazyn the Infinite stands apart even among the Necron dynasties. His presence is unmistakable in any environment he enters, not because he seeks grandeur, but because the underlying engineering of his rebuilt body projects a precision that no organic lifeform could imitate. Every recorded encounter describes the same immediate impression: a silhouette constructed with sharp geometries, deliberate symmetry, and reinforced exoskeletal framing that reflects the ancient philosophies of the Sautek lineage. Witnesses who survived contact often remarked that the movements of this being lacked acceleration and deceleration, creating the sense that his frame transitioned cleanly between one position and another without the micro-adjustments that accompany biological motion. The exterior finish of his necrodermis plating is consistently described as darker than that of standard Necron infantry. Instead of the pale metallic sheen associated with the rank and file of the Sautek dynasty, Trazyn's body carries a deeper mineral tone, similar to hematite polished by mechanical abrasion. The surface contains recessed channels of emerald light that pulse at regular intervals, coordinating with the quantum pathways inside the chassis. The illumination is not decorative but functional, highlighting the frequency modulation used by his internal power sources. In some recorded pic captures, the glow intensifies during teleportation, cataloguing operations or temporal displacement events, suggesting adaptive energy routing. Supporting the torso is a reinforced spinal architecture with visible ridges where stabilizing actuators meet the outer plating. These actuators compensate for the weight of integrated weapon systems and embedded dimensional technology, which would destabilize lesser constructs. The hands maintain the elongated skeletal profile characteristic of Necron nobles, but with additional jointed segments, allowing for fine manipulation of relics, artifacts, and stasis-sealed items. Administratum survey teams noted that Trazyn handled some of his collected objects with a level of care resembling archival tradition, rather than the utilitarian approach exhibited by most Necron units. The head crest mirrors the angular structure of the Sautek command class, though subtle differences mark him as unique within their hierarchy. The cranial vents are narrower and extend slightly further above the eyes, creating a design profile with vertical emphasis. The optic sensors emit a dual-layered green luminescence, a primary layer indicating real-time perception, and a secondary layer representing continuous scanning for objects of value. During moments where he is cataloguing surroundings, the secondary layer widens, forming a sharper ring of radiance around the main ocular glow. Servitors who witnessed these scans reported that the light refracted across their armor with unusual clarity, implying that the sensors operate on wavelengths outside human visible ranges, possibly overlapping interdimensional or chronometric detection bandwidths. Central to his identity, however, is the persistent aura of methodical assessment that follows him. Even without speech, the angle of his gaze and the measured pace of his posture imply an active audit of everything within reach. Civilians, soldiers, and even xenos combatants have described the sensation of being valued, weighed, or judged as if assessed for potential preservation. Though not hostile by default, this trait has led multiple witnesses to misunderstand his interest as imminent aggression. The truth is simpler and more disquieting. Trazyn monitors everything for historical significance, rarity, or utility to his overarching collection. Direct records from the Adeptus Mechanicus emphasize that Trazyn's frame is unusually well maintained for a Necron who spends extensive time away from his home tomb world. Many nobles exhibit signs of accumulated microfractures or plating erosion from long campaigns. Trazyn displays none. His body reflects consistent nanotechnological repair cycles, suggesting he prioritizes personal upkeep to ensure safe handling of fragile relics. The craftsmanship of his necrodermis carapace demonstrates manufacturing precision rarely seen outside upper echelons of the Necron aristocracy, reinforcing his role as a preserver and curator of irreplaceable artifacts. Weapons and gear define a significant portion of his identity, not due to brutality or destructive capability, but through their function within his broader purpose. The most recognizable instrument he carries is the empathic obliterator, a staff-shaped weapon with a long haft and an upper focal assembly composed of concentric metallic arcs. The arcs converge around an internal energy core that cycles between low and high resonance states. Unlike typical Necron weaponry, the empathic obliterator does not channel a coherent beam or energetic discharge. Instead, when activated, it releases an expanding pulse tuned to sympathetic resonance between entities of similar origin. Any group sharing cultural, genetic, or organizational identity becomes vulnerable to the pulse simultaneously. The effect does not discriminate by rank or distance. It propagates until resonance collapses or the energy matrix resets. Cases where this staff has been used are few, but each instance resulted in abrupt neutralization of entire clusters of enemy combatants. The weapon is not commonly deployed, not due to mechanical limitation, but because Trazyn appears to view it as an instrument of necessity rather than preference. For a being focused on preservation, mass destruction contradicts his goals. The empathic obliterator remains a tool reserved for protecting his collections or retrieving artifacts of critical importance. The device's lethality aligns with ancient Necron theory concerning harmonic annihilation rather than pure kinetic dominance. This distinguishes it from the more standardized Gauss technology used by the broader dynasties. Complementing the staff is a suite of translocation mechanisms integrated directly into his chassis. The most notable is the hyper-technical teleportation module that allows him to phase into and out of engagement zones without warning. This module draws power from dimensional reserves maintained within pocket vaults, linked to Solemnace, his personal stronghold. When activated, the teleportation leaves behind a faint distortion pattern resembling a collapsing grid. The phenomenon lasts only a fraction of a second, but observers have documented distortion severe enough to destabilize nearby data recorders. This has created difficulties for those attempting to map or predict Trazyn's movements, leading both Imperial and Xenos analysts to classify his mobility as inherently unpredictable. The teleportation capacity also connects to his ability to project surrogate bodies known as phylacteries. These constructs serve as remote shells through which he can operate without risking his primary form. Each secondary body maintains a baseline intelligence, allowing autonomous engagement if communication with Trazyn is interrupted. The shells share visual similarities with his main chassis, but lack the refined detailing and advanced sensory arrays. They exist to misdirect enemies, acquire artifacts, or function as temporary stand-ins while the true Trazyn manages more delicate operations elsewhere. Instances of these proxies appearing in multiple war zones simultaneously contributed to the early misconception that Trazyn the Infinite referred to a title or organizational role rather than one individual. It was only after consistent analysis of behavior patterns and recurring speech protocols that this assumption was corrected. His gear also includes a chronometrist instrument integrated into his left arm. Unlike the teleportation systems, which relocate him spatially, the chronometrist manipulates temporal perception. It enables Trazyn to adjust the local flow of time for fractions of a second, creating micro-windows to reposition, avoid attacks, or examine fast-moving objects. The effect does not alter time universally, nor does it permit large-scale manipulation. Instead, it offers precise temporal buffering, giving him a decisive advantage when navigating volatile environments or handling artifacts that might activate under specific temporal conditions. Administratum archivists have speculated that the chronometrist is also used during his inspections inside stasis vaults, where even minor fluctuations could compromise preservation. His appearance is further shaped by the object he carries most consistently after the empathic obliterator, the dimensional tesseract labyrinth. This device is suspended at his waist or secured to the back of his frame, depending on the operational context. The labyrinth is not ornate. Its exterior resembles an angular metallic cube etched with pathways resembling network diagrams. When activated, the cube unfolds through nonlinear geometry, creating a containment field capable of housing living beings, mechanical units, or relics of considerable size. The interior dimension is far larger than its exterior would suggest, reinforcing that the device operates on principles beyond standard Necron storage systems. Warriors of the Imperium have been captured within these constructs not through battle, but through the simple misfortune of being near Trazyn during collection events. This containment tool supports his broader function as a curator. His approach to acquiring specimens is not driven by malice, but by the belief that all eras must be preserved somewhere safe from the cycles of destruction characterizing the galaxy. The Tesseract Labyrinth allows him to remove individuals or objects from their native environments without inflicting unnecessary damage, though those captured may not share his appreciation for this method. Once secured, the items become part of his extensive museum in Solemnace, where they remain in stasis unless Trazyn chooses to utilize them as part of reenactments or for historical display. Another distinctive trait involves the frequency modulators embedded in his torso and shoulders. These components regulate communication between his primary neural core and remote servers maintained in undisclosed locations. When engaging in dialogue, his speech emits a resonant undertone, evidence of parallel data processing as he cross-references historical entries or adjusts collection priorities. His voice lacks the mechanical distortion typical of many Necron units. Instead, it carries an even, precise cadence optimized for clarity. Reports from Mechanicus linguists suggest that his vocal systems are calibrated to multiple linguistic registers simultaneously, allowing him to converse fluently with various species without requiring external translation. The registers do not override one another. They merge into a consistent pattern that the listener perceives as natural speech. His physical durability extends beyond surface plating. Internal systems include layered quantum shielding that activates in response to high-energy impacts. When triggered, these shields form a translucent matrix around his frame, dispersing incoming force across multiple micro-realities. The effect produces visual flickers as the shield recalibrates thousands of times per second. Though not impervious, this protective system allows Trazyn to endure assaults that would incapacitate many Necron nobles. Combined with his teleportation and temporal equipment, these shields ensure he can exit unfavorable situations without relying on external support. His connection to Solemnace influences additional traits that cannot be attributed solely to engineering. The repository houses stasis fields, chronometric galleries, and layered vaults filled with relics from innumerable civilizations. Trazyn carries encoded keys within his neural matrix that interface with these systems. When he retrieves items from the galleries, his frame synchronizes with the vault network, creating a temporary link that stabilizes both the artifact and the environment around him. This prevents cross-contamination between temporal fields and safeguards items that might behave unpredictably outside their optimized storage climate. No other Necron has demonstrated identical access, reinforcing that Trazyn alone curates and navigates the galleries with complete authority. There is a final trait that scholars regularly highlight when examining his profile. Despite the precision of his engineering, Trazyn displays behavior patterns that indicate a form of preference expression uncommon among Necrons. His fixation on acquisition, preservation, and historical reconstruction suggests a cognitive framework resembling the curatorial instincts of ancient human archivists. While many Necron nobles operate strictly on directive logic, Trazyn appears guided by an internal hierarchy of value shaped by personal assessment rather than imperial mandate. This does not imply emotion, but it does reflect selective prioritization. His willingness to negotiate, delay conflict, or trade artifacts indicates that he incorporates long-term goals into his strategies rather than relying on brute force. This tendency also appears in the way he presents himself. His posture is formal without being rigid. His movements are calculated but not aggressive. His speech choices avoid provocation unless provoked. Together, these traits portray a being who considers himself a guardian of historical continuity rather than a conqueror. Even so, his interactions with other factions frequently generate tension, as the concept of property, sovereignty, or cultural significance rarely aligns across species. For Trazyn, ownership is defined by the ability to preserve. For others, survival takes precedence. He carries no banners, sigils, or markers identifying him as part of a dynasty's ruling structure. Instead, the details of his frame and his distinctive armaments represent his authority. Surtek royalty recognize his autonomy, and even their pharaons tolerate his presence because his activities, while often disruptive, rarely threaten their strategic goals. His role sits slightly outside standard hierarchy, a position that grants both freedom and scrutiny. Trazyn uses this position efficiently, relying on his equipment and refined engineering to navigate environments that would destroy a lesser noble. His distinctive traits and gear ultimately reflect a singular philosophy: preservation through intervention. Every component of his body, each weapon, and every device he carries supports this goal. To understand Trazyn is to recognize that he embodies an intersection between ancient technological prowess and a worldview centered on retaining fragments of history before they vanish into conflict. He stands as a testament to the Necron capacity for precision, but also to the peculiar individuality that some nobles retained even after biotransference, making him one of the most unusual figures in the galaxy's long, fractured narrative. Across the fractured records of multiple civilizations, there are recurring attempts to describe the inner workings of Trazyn the Infinite. These accounts vary in tone, consistency, and reliability, yet they converge on one conclusion. His personality is distinct not only among the Necrons, but across the broader spectrum of galactic powers. The standard expectation of Necron nobles is a demeanor shaped entirely by logic, strategy, and ancient cultural protocol. Trazyn follows these patterns only insofar as they align with his long-standing mission of preservation. In every practical sense, his outlook drifts away from conventional hierarchy and into a category that most archivists struggle to define. His motivations remain coherent, but they do not mirror the territorial, imperial, or militaristic priorities that dominate the Necron dynasties. Instead, his behavior conveys the viewpoint of a curator who has decided that the galaxy is both a ruin in progress and a museum waiting to be catalogued. Those who have interacted with him describe a tone that lacks overt hostility, and yet carries a complete disregard for personal autonomy when it conflicts with his objectives. He operates with calm detachment, often speaking as if the situation unfolding around him has already been categorized and filed away in his mental archives. Even in high-tension encounters, his posture never shifts toward desperation or urgency. Instead, he seems to evaluate events as opportunities to expand his collection, or to observe the reactions of those involved. This approach has left many to consider him eccentric by Necron standards, an unusual classification for a race known for their structured precision. Imperial interrogators who analysed recovered Vox fragments highlighted that Trazyn often expresses mild disappointment when an artifact documented in ancient records proves damaged or incomplete. In one notable transmission, he expresses dissatisfaction at the deterioration of a relic battlefield standard, remarking that its condition is unrepresentative of its historical importance. The phrasing is clinical, but the underlying implication suggests a form of preference, a nuance rarely attributed to a Necron mind. It is not emotion in the human sense, but it hints at selective valuation driven by more than strategic calculus. There is also the manner in which he addresses individuals from other species. His speech patterns demonstrate an almost scholarly curiosity, rather than imperial condescension. He often questions the provenance of objects or demands contextual information before acting. When humans or xenos attempt negotiation, he listens with a stillness that can be mistaken for receptiveness. In truth, he merely processes the information for its historical worth, before deciding whether the interaction serves his goals. Many have misinterpreted this as signs of diplomacy. It is more accurate to describe it as a temporary alignment of priorities. When conversation no longer benefits him, he disengages immediately and without remorse. His personality also encompasses a trait that confounds his adversaries, a tendency toward reenactment. Within the galleries of Solemnace, he reconstructs ancient battles, conflicts, and cultural rituals using stasis-preserved individuals, relic war machines, and historical paraphernalia arranged with meticulous accuracy. To him, these reconstructions serve as living memory, an effort to safeguard events from fading into obscurity. Outsiders view them as macabre exhibitions, but Trazyn makes no attempt to frame them as entertainment or spectacle. He sees the galaxy through a historical lens, and these displays represent a commitment to preserving the essence of eras that would otherwise be erased by war, entropy, or cultural collapse. His interest in reenactments does not stem from vanity. It stems from an unwavering belief that the significance of past events must not be diluted by time. Analysing his organisational alignment requires understanding his position within the Sautek dynasty, as well as his broader relationship with Necron society. At first glance, Trazyn appears to operate at the periphery of dynastic structure. He does not command legions, claim territories, or engage in large-scale military campaigns. His focus remains almost entirely directed toward preservation, cataloguing, and acquisition. Despite this, he maintains a recognised rank among the Necron nobility. He is not a renegade or outcast, as his actions, while disruptive, do not threaten the strategic foundation of the Sautek dynasty. Most Phaerons tolerate his independence because his objectives rarely intersect with conventional dynastic goals. When they do intersect, the outcomes vary between temporary cooperation and significant irritation. The Sautek dynasty, under the rule of Imhotep the Stormlord, is known for strict discipline, hierarchical efficiency, and an unyielding emphasis on strategic domination. Within this context, Trazyn represents an anomaly. His autonomy is allowed partly because removing him would require a level of internal conflict that dynastic leaders consider wasteful. More importantly, Trazyn's activities occasionally benefit the dynasty in unpredictable ways. During large-scale conflicts, he has supplied forces or artifacts at moments that aligned with Sautek interests, though these contributions were often driven by his own motivations rather than loyalty. He once released an entire legion of preserved warriors onto a battlefield, not to aid the dynasty, but to recreate a historic war he found noteworthy. The resulting conflict weakened mutual enemies, indirectly benefiting Sautek holdings. This pattern of accidental alignment is a defining aspect of his relationship with the dynasty. Technomancers analysing Necron political structures classify Trazyn as a functionally independent noble whose strategic relevance lies not in military command but in his unparalleled control over preserved forces. His personal museum contains countless warriors, machines, and relics held in stasis. These assets grant him a power base unrelated to conventional dynastic armies. When circumstances demand, he can deploy stasis-preserved units that originate from multiple eras and species, creating unusually structured fighting forces that defy standard composition logic. This capability makes him simultaneously unpredictable and indispensable. Beyond the Sautek dynasty, Trazyn maintains a network of influence more subtle than direct alliances. Several dynasties acknowledge his expertise in identifying, extracting, and preserving relics that would otherwise be lost to destruction. While his methods often involve taking items without consent, the results occasionally yield artifacts valuable to Necrons themselves. For this reason, some dynasties have entered temporary arrangements with him, offering access to sealed repositories in exchange for information or technical assistance. Just as often, these arrangements end abruptly due to disagreements regarding ownership. Necron society, despite its emphasis on order, remains fragmented by ancient rivalries, and Trazyn maneuvering within this environment requires both caution and calculated detachment. His alignment with external factions is even more complex. The Imperium views him as a xenos threat, albeit one that does not operate on predictable strategic lines. Records from the Ordo Xenos categorize him as a high-risk anomaly, citing multiple incidents where his activities disrupted Imperial campaigns. At the same time, there are instances where his objectives inadvertently aligned with Imperial survival. One notable occurrence involved an artifact he sought from an active battlefield. His retrieval action neutralized a significant enemy force, allowing Imperial units to retreat with fewer casualties. The event was not an act of mercy, it was simply a secondary outcome of his archive-driven objectives. Other Xenos factions treat him with varying degrees of caution. The Eldar, who possess their own reverence for history, view Trazyn with deep suspicion, particularly when his acquisitions involve relics of their ancient empire. Orc warbands find no consistent pattern in his behaviour, though they often interpret his sudden appearances as challenges or omens. The Tau Empire lacks comprehensive data on him and categorizes him as a technologically advanced anomaly. Only the Tyranids show absolute indifference, as his value-oriented behavior has no meaning when confronted by a species that consumes everything indiscriminately. The final analysis of Trazyn the Infinite requires acknowledging the unusual intersection between purpose and personality that he represents. His actions can neither be classified solely as predatory nor benevolent. He does not pursue conquest, yet his presence disrupts the balance of power wherever he appears. He does not seek destruction, yet he will employ lethal force without hesitation if it protects a relic he considers significant. His priorities revolve around an internal hierarchy built on preservation, historical significance, and contextual integrity. To him, the galaxy is not a battlefield to be dominated. It is a series of eras collapsing under their own instability, each containing fragments of meaning worth capturing before they fade. Trazyn's most defining characteristic may be his perception of time. Where others see linear progression, he treats history as a series of interconnected cycles that must be maintained through documentation and preservation. This perspective explains his willingness to intervene in major conflicts not to alter their outcomes, but to secure artifacts or individuals that represent turning points. He interprets these artifacts not as trophies, but as anchors securing the continuity of recorded memory. In this sense, he serves a role that no other Necron seeks to fulfill, a guardian of the past during an age where destruction outpaces remembrance. Yet this mission carries consequences. For those drawn into his collection, whether willingly or through force, preservation becomes imprisonment. His stasis vaults contain living beings held indefinitely, removed from their native timelines to serve as reference points in displays or reconstructions. The ethical weight of this practice is irrelevant to him, as he sees no contradiction between preservation and captivity. In his view, existence within a controlled archive is superior to disappearance through war or decay. This reasoning exposes the largest divergence between Trazyn and the species he interacts with. Where others value freedom or agency, he values continuity. Where others fear erasure, he fears the loss of context. Despite these complexities, Trazyn remains consistent in his overarching philosophy. He does not change his objectives to suit political or military pressures. He does not deviate based on fear, opportunism, or emotion. His path was set millennia before the current era, shaped by a worldview that survived biotransference and rests on a foundation of duty rather than self-interest. For this reason, predicting his next move is difficult. Understanding the motives behind it is not. He will continue to preserve what he deems historically valuable, intervene when circumstances threaten the integrity of the past, and disregard any authority that obstructs this mission. In the galaxy's constant cycle of expansion, collapse, and rebirth, Trazyn the Infinite stands apart as a stabilizing anomaly. He's not a ruler, conqueror, or warlord. He's a custodian of a heritage too vast for any single species to manage. His personality reflects this purpose through methodical detachment, careful assessment, and selective engagement. His organizational alignment reflects it through sustained independence within a rigid dynastic structure. His legacy will not be measured in conquered worlds or defeated enemies, but in the fragments of eras he has chosen to preserve against oblivion. The earliest references to the being later identified as Trazyn the Infinite emerge in scattered administratum recovery logs that attempt to catalogue unusual disruptions in archaeological expeditions, relic convoys, or newly cleared tomb complex surveys. The entries rarely name him directly, as Imperial functionaries could not initially place an identity upon the figure whose interventions left no organic residue, no Vox signatures, and no evidence of conventional propulsion or atmospheric displacement. Instead, the observations appear as fragmented annotations in damage reports or shipment discrepancies, usually phrased in a way that reveals the administratum's discomfort with anything that disrupts their codified procedures. The phenomenon that would eventually be classified under the same entry cluster as later confirmed Necron activity appeared to follow a consistent pattern. Items vanished without signs of forced entry. Power systems in proximity suffered brief but measurable static interference, and Imperial personnel reported momentary displacement of time-stamped chronometers. These anomalies, while subtle, stacked over centuries into a logistical puzzle that the administratum could not easily ignore. When Adeptus Mechanicus archivists were later granted partial access to these findings, they recognized signatures that aligned with other suspected Necron incursions across different sectors. Their analyses prioritized patterns of energy dissipation, transport anomalies, and the absence of thermal gradients normally associated with teleportation technology. The Mechanicus noted that Necron phase technology produced a uniquely sterile transition signature, one that neither displaced atmospheric gases nor produced the conventional tachyon afterglow registered in human teleportation systems. Although most expedition commanders had originally interpreted these disturbances as malfunctioning equipment or possible xenos sabotage, the Mechanicus repositioned these collected anomalies into a coherent technological profile. Through this lens, the administratum's previously scattered notes began converging toward the same conclusion. An unknown agent with access to stable dimensional displacement was selecting Imperial artifacts with almost curatorial precision. This raised immediate concerns within the administratum because the scale of missing items exceeded what could be easily reconciled as routine loss. Some entries involved relics classified under restricted heritage catalogues, including weapons, armor fragments, and ceremonial objects safeguarded for centuries. Others involved more sensitive materials, sealed data slates documenting pre-compliance histories, minor xenotech trinkets taken from controlled vaults, and a few early-age cultural artifacts of populations lost to Imperial reorganization. The common pattern in these disappearances puzzled the administrator more than the thefts themselves. The selected items had little strategic value. Many were ceremonial or symbolic, others were historically obscure. Yet this level of precision reflected an intelligence with a flawless understanding of cultural trajectories and historical symbolism, which disturbed the administrator more deeply than outright strategic plunder would have. An enemy seeking firepower would have taken weapons, an enemy seeking sabotage would have destroyed infrastructure. But the agent behind these incidents seemed to possess an archivist sensibility, not a conqueror's one. When the identity was finally matched to Trazyn the Infinite through Mechanicus intelligence cross-referencing, the impression recorded in formal internal analytics described him as an entity driven by what one adept described as a historical appetite rather than a military one. The administratum struggled with this phrasing, as they preferred the certainty of quantifiable motivations, yet the Mechanicus insisted that the pattern held true across all documented encounters. Trazyn targeted artifacts linked to key cultural or historical developments, even if the connection was obscure. A relic from an abandoned shrine might hold little meaning to the humans who lived near it, but Trazyn retrieved it because the shrine itself belonged to a broader cultural evolution that later fed into a larger socio-political structure. This perspective startled Imperial analysts, who realized that he possessed a scope of historical knowledge extending far beyond any human capability. The administratum's most extensive macro-historical databases still relied on partial reconstructions, doctrinal filtering, and incomplete planetary records. By contrast, Trazyn operated with clarity regarding events that predated the Imperium entirely. Mechanicus Magi found this precision unsettling from a technological standpoint, because it required a form of data retention that exceeded the known limitations of any living or post-organic intelligence available to the Imperium. Trazyn's consistent ability to isolate singular items across thousands of years of human expansion indicated access to sensory archives, predictive models, and historical mapping systems that rivaled the most advanced noospheric engines in the Adeptus Mechanicus. If his archives indeed contained millennia of cross-referenced data from countless species, as machine cult sources suspected, then his level of informational organization surpassed even the most advanced Imperial schema. While the Mechanicus tactically respected this achievement, they also recognized its threat. An intelligence with that degree of historical awareness could anticipate human behaviors to a degree that the Imperium would struggle to counter. These assessments triggered a moderate escalation in internal Adeptus Mechanicus threat evaluations. While Trazyn did not behave like a conventional enemy, he did not deploy armies to seize worlds nor demonstrate interest in territorial consolidation, he nonetheless undermined Imperial control through selective disruption of cultural heritage. The Mechanicus understood that history is a weapon. Historical artifacts determine cultural continuity. Cultural continuity informs loyalty. Loyalty supports Imperial structure. If an external agent could reshape or appropriate historical symbols before the Imperium even understood their significance, that agent wielded a subtle yet powerful influence over humanity's long-term narrative. The Administratum, in its own way, reached similar conclusions through a purely logistical lens. They assessed the impact of Trazyn's actions not by motives, but by disruptions in their systems. Each missing artifact represented a disruption in record-keeping, a lapse in chain-of-custody protocols, and a potential breach in sector-level archival integrity. Over centuries, this built into an accounting nightmare. Administratum officials rely on rigid categories, and Trazyn's actions created anomalies that refuse categorization. Reports would list objects as relocated without authorization by unknown mechanism, misplaced through unexplained circumstances, or removed by unidentifiable third party. These phrases did not conform to standard codification, creating further bureaucratic friction. Many such reports remained unresolved for generations, collecting marginalia from scribes who attempted to rationalize the missing entries through administrative or environmental explanations. The more ambitious clerks proposed that the disappearances represented a new pattern of xenos intrusion, but without military casualties or battlefield wreckage, their suggestions carried little weight. The turning point occurred when the Adeptus Mechanicus deployed targeted survey teams to previously stable sites and detected faint but consistent residual energy traces. These anomalies suggested highly controlled teleportation signatures that did not match any known human or allied xenos template. When compared with energy readings collected from the tomb complexes of other dynastic Necron sites, the correlation became undeniable. Once this connection was established, the Administratum retroactively amended hundreds of logistical reports, consolidating them under new classifications related to suspected Necron interference. For the first time, they possessed a structured bureaucratic pathway to interpret the previously inexplicable. This did not diminish the disruptions themselves, but it did offer a framework through which they could be recorded. Mechanicus observers, meanwhile, focused on analysing the technology implied by Trazyn's selective intrusions. The precision of his extractions suggested mastery of spatial manipulation, matter phase transitions, and interference fields that resisted conventional detection. The technology allowed him to bypass automated defences, hard steel vaults, bio-encoded locks, and even certain Mechanicus sanctums without leaving traceable evidence of entry. Tech priests viewed this with equal parts admiration and concern. Their reverence for lost technologies made Trazyn's capabilities a symbol of what humanity had forgotten, yet their duty to protect Imperial knowledge made him a direct obstacle to their work. They understood that if his methods could be replicated or even partially deciphered, it would reshape the entire foundation of Imperial logistics. However, any attempts to confront or capture his technology were impractical. His mastery of dimensional transport eliminated the possibility of traditional countermeasures. Even if cornered, he could escape instantaneously. And even if somehow neutralized, the Mechanicus doubted they could reverse engineer a Necron artifact without catastrophic consequences. Administratum analysis also attempted to determine whether Trazyn's movements followed predictable timelines. Some believed that his appearances were tied to specific historical events, as his activity often increased around periods of cultural upheaval or the rediscovery of forgotten worlds. Others argued that his motivations were independent of human affairs, and that the Imperium merely intersected with his pursuits by coincidence. This disagreement persisted for centuries without resolution. The Administratum eventually adopted a working theory that Trazyn's movements correlated with the unearthing of artifacts that fit his criteria for collection, regardless of the context. Whenever a lost relic resurfaced, or whenever Imperial explorers uncovered ruins from past civilizations, Trazyn's probability of involvement increased. This allowed the Administratum to anticipate potential disruptions, though they admitted that anticipation did not equate to prevention. Their records noted that even when they deployed additional patrols or restricted site access, Trazyn circumvented these protections effortlessly. The Adeptus Mechanicus, however, took a more technical approach. Their surveys examined the lingering aftermath of Trazyn's appearances, disrupted data tracks, minor gravitational fluctuations, and short-lived particle traces that hinted at exotic matter generation. These clues allowed them to construct rudimentary models of the processes involved, though the models remained incomplete. Some Magi believed that Trazyn employed technology that blended controlled phase shifting with a form of pocket dimension storage. This would explain his ability to transport vast numbers of artifacts without visible infrastructure. Others argued that the spatial mechanics involved exceeded current Mechanicus understanding entirely, suggesting either an older pre-dynastic technology or a contemporary Necron advancement beyond even known baseline standards. The debate continues within Mechanicus circles, but all agree that Trazyn operates with deliberate efficiency rather than experimental risk. His technology functions flawlessly, which implies a deep confidence in systems that would be catastrophically dangerous if improperly calibrated. The Administratum's broader impression of Trazyn is shaped less by technological understanding and more by administrative consequence. They view him as a destabilizing force, not because he attacks Imperial assets, but because he undermines the consistency of their historical records. Administratum institutions rely upon continuity of data to justify resource distribution, validate claims, authenticate relics, and maintain ideological cohesion. When an external entity selectively removes artifacts that anchor cultural narratives, it creates gaps in their administrative memory. These gaps may appear minor at first, but they accumulate into broader structural issues. A relic missing from a shrine might cause local spiritual uncertainty. A ceremonial weapon stolen from a governor's archive could disrupt regional traditions. A lost data slate documenting early colonization could alter a planet's claim legitimacy. Such ripple effects remain difficult to measure, but the Administratum acknowledges that they exist. Their overall impression of Trazyn is that of an archivist whose interest in history conflicts fundamentally with Imperial modes of record maintenance. For the Mechanicus, the impression is more ambivalent. They respect Trazyn's methods and recognize in him a kind of curator whose goals revolve around preservation rather than destruction. They analyze his actions as part of a broader Necron trend toward maintaining historical knowledge through tangible artifacts. Some Magi theorize that Trazyn's purposes align with a long-term Necron desire to catalogue every civilization's rise and fall, preserving each stage as part of a grand cosmic record. Others argue that Trazyn functions independently of dynastic command, acting out of personal preference rather than political directive. Regardless of his internal motivations, the Mechanicus remains aware that his technological capabilities create unavoidable vulnerabilities in Imperial defense logic. Any artifact, no matter how secured, remains vulnerable to extraction if Trazyn deems it significant. Others argue that Trazyn functions independently of dynastic command, acting out of personal preference rather than political directive. Regardless of his internal motivations, the Mechanicus remains aware that his technological capabilities create unavoidable vulnerabilities in Imperial defense logic. Any artifact, no matter how secured, remains vulnerable to extraction if Trazyn deems it significant. The Adeptus Mechanicus perceives him as a reminder of technological inferiority and a potential key to understanding lost sciences. Both acknowledge that confronting him directly is nearly impossible, and both recognize that his actions will continue regardless of Imperial resistance. His influence, though indirect, is substantial, and from their collective perspective, the Imperium must treat him not merely as a xenos raider or relic thief, but as a long-term variable within the broader calculation of galactic stability. The institution commonly referred to by Imperial observers as Trazyn's Museum is not a museum in any human sense. The label survives only because it is the nearest approximation available to administratum classification systems, and even then it remains an imprecise attempt to conceptualize something far older, broader, and functionally alien. The Mechanicus prefers the term repository, while certain xenologists suggest that the structure operates more like a stasis-anchored historical vault that intersects multiple dimensional thresholds. Yet even these designations feel insufficient when weighed against the sheer magnitude of what Trazyn has curated. The space defies simple geometry, expanding far beyond the boundaries of its metallic exterior. Internal Mechanicus modelling suggests that its spatial volume cannot be reconciled with the shape it occupies in real space. This has led to the widely accepted conclusion that Trazyn's collection exists partially outside conventional space, anchored to a large Necron tomb complex but extending into non-linear dimensions that resist Imperial measurement. Imperial records that reference the interior describe it with restrained bafflement. Some testimonies originate from the rare instances in which Imperial individuals were brought inside, typically through circumstances that left the witnesses uncertain whether they remained within linear reality during their visit. Others derive from data recovery fragments extracted from Mechanicus explorator teams that managed to capture glimpses of the structure's deeper layers. Across all sources, one consistent element persists. The museum operates as a monumental codification of countless epochs, species, wars, cultures, and singular events. Each display, if display is even an appropriate term, encapsulates a moment or figure selected by Trazyn according to criteria known only to him. Although the Imperium has attempted to construct an index of the museum's contents, no attempt has ever succeeded. Each time the Mechanicus assembled a working theory regarding the internal layout, follow-up encounters disproved previous assumptions. Galleries that had been described in early accounts did not appear in later ones, while newly observed chambers seemed to materialize as fully formed annexes, complete with stasis fields, luminant conduits, and silent custodial constructs. Some believe the museum reconfigures itself in response to Trazyn's shifting interests. Others propose that it contains segments anchored across different spatial layers, and that visitors perceive only the portion currently aligned with their dimensional frame. Regardless of interpretation, the result remains the same. No static map exists, and none can be created. Within these shifting halls reside thousands of artifacts that hold profound historical weight. The Imperium only recognizes a fraction of them, but even that fraction conveys the staggering scope of the collection. Entire regiments, preserved in the final moments of their most desperate battles, stand frozen in stasis as if merely paused rather than captured. These displays often include enemies locked in the same suspended moment, their weapons inches from impact, their expressions rigid with either defiance or despair. Mechanicus archivists note that the detail in these suspended tableaux is exact down to the microscopic level. This indicates that Trazyn's acquisition method likely captures not only the individuals involved, but also the surrounding environment atmosphere, particulate matter, and ambient light. Such precision would require an energy expenditure beyond anything the Imperium can produce without risking catastrophic instability. Yet the museum is not limited to large-scale captures. Its smaller halls display artifacts ranging from the obscure to the cosmically significant. There are preserved banners from human worlds lost long before compliance. There are relics from xenos empires that existed millions of years before humanity evolved. There are weapon prototypes that match no known technological lineage. The Mechanicus considers some of these objects to represent entirely extinct forms of engineering. Others appear deliberately inert, their functions locked behind stasis fields that defy even the most invasive tech rites. The Imperium understands almost none of them, though archivists speculate that Trazyn does not collect for the sake of utility, but for preservation of historical context. The categorization appears to follow a logic that prioritizes narrative continuity, but continuity at a cosmic scale, not merely a cultural one. Among all documented sections of the museum, the halls containing preserved warriors draw the most attention from administratum observers. This is not due to their strategic relevance. The individuals displayed there rarely hold known military importance, but due to the manner of their preservation. Each figure exists in a perfect stasis lock. Their armor remains unblemished by decay. Their biological matter shows no sign of degradation. Even their emotional states are preserved at the instant of capture, suspended in a moment that has no continuation. To the administratum, this raises logistical questions regarding the integrity of identity, memory, and time itself. If a warrior can be taken at the moment of their death and preserved eternally, then the museum becomes a place where history is not merely remembered but held immobile, physically preventing its dissolution. The implications disturb many Imperial scholars who wrestle with the notion that Trazyn defines history not through documentation, but through collection. Mechanicus analyses reveal something deeper. Stasis fields within the museum operate with a stability that far exceeds human equivalents. Imperial stasis technology suffers from entropy creep, gradual field drift, and risk of temporal shear, especially over long durations. Necron stasis systems, by contrast, function as if completely immune to temporal decay. This suggests access to control over chronal flow that the Imperium does not possess. Some magi argue that Necron stasis is not merely temporal suspension, but a form of dimensional anchoring that removes the object from active time. If this is true, then Trazyn's displays do not simply preserve. They extract the object or individual from linear causality altogether. For the Mechanicus, this represents a technological mystery so profound that it borders on theological significance. Stasis without risk contradicts everything they understand about the universe's fundamental decay. There is also the matter of the custodial constructs that maintain the collection. These entities appear in various forms, some resembling standard Necron warriors, others taking shapes not seen elsewhere in the galaxy. They move with deliberate efficiency, their actions synchronized with purposes that remain unreadable to Imperial observers. Some appear responsible for field maintenance, others for repositioning artifacts, while a few act as sentries, though no intruder has ever been recorded destroying one. Their silence and precision reinforce the impression that the entire museum operates as a single organism, guided by an intelligence distributed across thousands of interconnected systems. The Mechanicus interprets this as an example of a perfectly unified command structure, a point of envy for a priesthood that often suffers internal disagreements and doctrinal disputes. Administratum records, by contrast, focus on the political implications of Trazyn's collection. The fact that he possesses artifacts from across the Imperium and from civilizations that rose and fell long before it positions him as an archivist with an unparalleled overview of galactic history. For a bureaucracy that depends on narrative continuity to maintain cohesion across millions of planets, the knowledge that an external entity holds a more complete record of humanity's past is deeply unsettling. Many administratum scholars quietly note that if Trazyn wished to manipulate the Imperium indirectly, he could likely do so by releasing select artifacts or withholding others. Cultural memory is fragile, and the Imperium relies heavily on relics to sustain morale, unity, and ideological alignment. A single artifact from a world's founding era can stabilize entire social structures. The removal or reintroduction of such objects can reshape identity, loyalty, or belief. In this sense, the museum becomes an unspoken form of influence, not through violence, but through the manipulation of history's physical anchors. The Imperium's greatest unease arises from the fact that Trazyn's collection does not appear to follow a linear or predictable acquisition pattern. He displays artifacts from different eras alongside one another, mixing items separated by millions of years with no apparent concern for temporal sequence. Some scholars interpret this as an expression of a viewpoint that sees time not as a line, but as a continuum that can be examined from any angle. Others argue that Trazyn categorizes according to themes the Imperium cannot decipher, arranging items by conceptual similarity rather than chronological succession. For instance, one chamber described in Mechanicus' testimony reportedly held a preserved Orc warlord alongside an ancient human astronomer, several crystalline consciousness matrices from an unknown species, and a shattered but still resonant Eldar artifact. The connection between these objects remains invisible to Imperial understanding, yet their placement suggests deliberate curation. The museum's most controversial displays involve major historical events frozen in their final moments. Some Mechanicus logs reference enormous dioramas of battlefields preserved with absolute fidelity. The Imperium cannot confirm which battles these scenes represent, though a few magi claim that some resemble conflicts from the War in Heaven, events long believed unrecoverable due to the incomprehensible antiquity of that era. If true, then Trazyn's museum contains not just artifacts from ancient epochs, but literal fragments of primordial history, extracted from a time so distant that it predates the existence of humanity's ancestors by millions of years. Such a possibility defies administratum chronology and exceeds the Mechanicus' ability to model causality. It reinforces the conclusion that Trazyn collects not merely objects, but turning points, securing the pivotal moments of galactic evolution as if they were ornaments. There are also displays that hold living beings, or beings suspended at the brink of living termination. Some Imperium sources claim that individuals within the exhibits retain consciousness, aware at some level of their suspended state. This claim remains unverified, and Mechanicus studies lean toward the interpretation that consciousness is halted along with biological activity. Yet the uncertainty persists, and the possibility that entire regiments may exist in silent awareness for millennia raises ethical concerns that the Imperium is ill-equipped to address, particularly when directed toward a xenos entity whose motivations do not align with human values. Despite these troubling implications, Trazyn's museum carries a strange sense of order that fascinates Mechanicus scholars. Each artifact, regardless of size or nature, appears meticulously maintained. There is no detectable decay, no sign of dust, oxidation, or microfracture. The museum's environmental systems, if environmental systems are even the correct term, maintain perfect conditions for each object, adapting seamlessly to whatever material composition it possesses. Some chambers mimic the atmospheric composition of extinct worlds, presumably to preserve items in their original ecological context. Others maintain stasis fields tuned to frequencies matching the energy signatures of the artifact's original environments. This level of care reinforces the impression that Trazyn is not merely a collector, but a curator driven by an intense commitment to preserving the integrity of history. The scope of the collection has led to philosophical debate within certain administratum circles. If history can be extracted, preserved, and stored indefinitely, then what remains of its temporal significance? Does a moment lose meaning when removed from the context of cause and effect? Mechanicus scholars approach the question differently, asking instead what happens to the timeline when a significant figure or object is removed from its final moment. Does the universe compensate? Does history deviate? Or is the captured moment part of a pre-existing loop that closes seamlessly, unaffected by its own extraction? Such questions remain unanswered, though the existence of Trazyn's museum forces the Imperium to confront them, even if quietly. Ultimately, the museum stands as a testament to Trazyn's singular worldview. It reflects an understanding of history as something tangible, something that can be arranged, protected, and displayed for purposes known only to him. The Imperium can neither decipher his organizational logic nor anticipate his future acquisitions. They only recognize that each addition to his museum represents the removal of a moment from the natural progression of time and culture. This, more than any battlefield engagement or technological advantage, is what makes Trazyn a long-term variable in the Imperium's future. He collects not for power, not for strategy, but for the preservation of narratives that transcend individual civilizations, and in doing so he shapes the silent memory of the galaxy in ways that are subtle, deliberate, and beyond human control. Trazyn's recorded wars exist in a strange category of Imperial data catalogues, occupying a liminal space between confirmed military actions and incidents the Administratum classifies as non-standard engagements. The difficulty is simple. Trazyn's involvement in any given conflict tends to be indirect, erratic, and guided by motives unrelated to territorial ambition or material defeat. When Mechanicus Archaeovists attempt to quantify his battlefield influence, they often discover that the raw numbers, casualties inflicted, cities destabilized, war zones altered, are merely the residue of a much larger and stranger objective. This complicates standard classification protocols, since traditional Necron patterns emphasize slow-moving, ultra-precise territorial reclamation. Trazyn, by contrast, behaves like a researcher, manipulating variables in a long experiment, with armies, regiments, and civilizations serving as instruments rather than targets. The earliest recognized encounter that the Mechanicus confidently connects to Trazyn is the conflict known to the Ordo Xenos as the Khyber Pass incident, involving the near disappearance of a local Imperial Guard regiment during a sudden Necron awakening event. Standardized Administratum review later confirmed that the regiment had not been killed, absorbed, or scattered. They had simply vanished. Only much later would cross-comparison reveal that a force visually matching their uniforms and banners appeared as a living exhibit of the Varden elite within Trazyn's collection. In typical fashion, the entire regiment had been preserved, catalogued, and displayed as though part of a military museum diorama. The Administratum noted that the retrieval of this regiment would require a diplomatic process that does not exist, an assault capability beyond feasibility, or a compliance fee Trazyn would arbitrarily define, likely in the form of some object of extreme historical significance. Thus the conflict technically ended with no winners, only the quiet loss of a full battle-hardened unit that remains on loan to the Infinite. A more catastrophic example is the War in the Museum, a localized but deceptively severe clash on Solemnace triggered by attempted theft, sabotage, and competing Necron dynastic pressures. While most Necron conflicts leave only strategic devastation and logic-driven maneuvers, this war demonstrated the absurdity of confronting Trazyn on his home territory. Imperial data analysts quickly realized that combat within his galleries is not only unfavorable, but impossible to categorize by standard threat-level metrics. The galleries themselves shift, restructure, and reconfigure as though guided by a consciousness equal to or greater than Trazyn's own. Exhibits awaken, relics activate, constructs deploy, and stored armies reanimate in perfectly preserved fighting condition. Entire battles, long past, are suddenly replayed with alarming accuracy, except this time the combatants identify intruders as new objectives. Mechanicus observers noted that the museum behaves almost like a self-defending archive of history, where the past is more lethal than the present. The Administratum's conclusion is concise. Military intrusion into Solemnace is not viable, not recommended, and not rational. Any faction attempting it is effectively declaring war not on a Necron lord, but on history itself. Another recorded Trazyn intervention occurred during the final stages of the Second Siege of Tesserae Prime. Imperial commanders believed a Necron assault was imminent, only for Trazyn to deploy a collection of perfectly preserved Elderly aspect warriors onto the battlefield, fighting in defense of neither side, but reenacting an ancient war that had once occurred on a planet of similar geography. The confusion destabilized frontline formations, broke chain of command cohesion, and disrupted strategic planning for both Imperial and Xenos forces. Administratum records list the event not as an attack but as a historical interruption, a classification created specifically for this single anomaly. Mechanicus analysts later confirmed that the aspect warriors were not alive in any traditional biological sense, but animated constructs stabilized through arcane cryptech methodologies. They executed flawless strikes with no strategic goal, no territorial aim, and no interest in survival. The Mechanicus concluded that this was not warfare, this was a demonstration. Trazyn's indirect participation in the battle for Cadia, specifically his deployment of an antique world-breaker block of Mechanicum thralls, continues to be studied by the Adeptus Mechanicus as a technical outlier. These thralls, believed long lost, demonstrated operational behaviours exceeding the predictions of tech archaeologist models by several magnitudes. Their deployment created a gap in the Chaos siege line that briefly allowed retreating Imperial factions to reorganise and evacuate critical assets. Trazyn's motives remain ambiguous, though Mechanicus thinkers theorise that he was attempting to protect a relic buried beneath the planet's crust, or to ensure the proper preservation of a catastrophic event. Administratum strategists, reviewing the full aftermath, noted that Trazyn's intervention created the illusion of allyship without fulfilling any criteria for Imperial cooperation. He preserved what he wished to preserve. Everything else was collateral. The aftermath of Trazyn-influenced conflict typically leaves Mechanicus survey teams with deeply inconvenient logistical puzzles. When a war zone contains relics, artifacts, banners, statues, texts, or even full individuals missing from their expected post-battle positions, the default assumption becomes, Trazyn was here. Administratum scribes have even developed a shorthand notation, a 3-mark sigil, signifying the suspected involvement of the Infinite when casualties, missing items, and irreproducible anomalies appear in combination. This shorthand is used not because it resolves the issue, but because it saves hundreds of work hours in bureaucratic explanation. Trazyn's presence transforms clear strategic narratives into fractured mosaics that challenge basic record-keeping. From the Adeptus Mechanicus perspective, these events collectively reveal an unsettling truth. Trazyn's wars are not wars at all. They're extraction missions, they're research exercises, they are historical curations conducted on a planetary scale. His armies do not conquer, they secure assets. His losses are negligible, his objectives are obscure, and his victories are measured not in territory, but in the acquisition of context, rarity, or narrative completeness. In effect, the Infinite behaves like a historian whose methods happen to involve the mobilization of hyper-advanced deathless legions. The Administratum provides a harsher assessment. When reviewing the sum of his interventions, they conclude that Trazyn represents a long-term threat to record integrity and strategic reliability. He destabilizes the logical flow of war, introduces factors beyond prediction, and drains frontline forces of individuals who may possess critical value. Every stolen regiment, captured officer, or preserved hero becomes a missing piece in the chronicle of Imperial defense. The Administratum does not view this as malicious, they view it as catastrophic indifference. The combined analysis produces a final assessment accepted by both institutions. Trazyn the Infinite is not a conventional enemy, nor a conventional ally, nor a predictable xenos power. He is a singular anomaly, whose actions, while rarely aimed at Imperial destruction, consistently compromise Imperial stability. His interventions can save a world or doom it, depending not on political alignment, but on the alignment of his personal interests with historical preservation. The Adeptus Mechanicus recommends strict observational engagement only, with no attempts at retrieval, retaliation, or negotiation unless the object in question is of existential value. The Administratum recommends the avoidance of open warfare at all costs, citing the unpredictable ecological, historical, and bureaucratic fallout that occurs whenever Trazyn decides that the battlefield itself contains something he wishes to catalogue. In the end, both institutions reach the same conclusion. Confronting Trazyn is not a matter of military strength but narrative control, and the Imperium has never been good at winning wars against those who reshape the narrative instead of participating in it. The earliest Inquisition records concerning Trazyn the Infinite do not appear in Ordo Xenos archives, as might be expected, but instead surface in restricted Ordo Chronos vaults that predate several reorganizations of the office. These records were originally classified under anomaly tracking rather than Necron activity. The reason becomes clear upon reading the first fragments. The Imperium did not initially understand that the presence being observed was a dynastic Necron. The first observers could only describe a figure that appeared simultaneously present and misplaced, as though history itself was struggling to situate him within a proper timeline. This difficulty in categorization has continued through every subsequent century of inquisitorial study. Even now, long after the revelation of the Necron dynasties and the awakening tomb worlds, Trazyn's existence remains incompatible with the investigative frameworks used to analyze hostile xenos species. The Inquisition's first consolidated impression of Trazyn is that he behaves not as a ruler, not as a warlord, and not as a commander, but as a curator. This observation is repeated across almost every Ordo report. It is treated neither as praise nor condemnation. Rather, it is a statement of functional behavior, describing a being whose motivations orbit around acquisition, preservation, and the arrangement of material history. When the Inquisition refers to him as a curator, the term is used with clinical distance, but also a degree of unease. A curator implies judgment, a curator implies selection, and a curator with the reach, longevity, and technological mastery of Trazyn poses a threat not because of what he destroys, but because of what he chooses to keep. Many Inquisitors describe Trazyn's actions as operating on a scale that the Imperium cannot easily perceive. Ordo Xenos observers have repeatedly noted that Trazyn rarely intervenes in conflicts out of malice or aggression. Instead, he appears during moments when a relic, artifact, specimen, or significant historical moment in progress is present. These events are often catastrophic for local populations not because Trazyn inflicts destruction directly, but because battles tend to escalate around the objects he desires. His arrival often coincides with extreme electromagnetic interference, temporal disruptions, and localized dimensional instability, although it remains unclear whether these effects are deliberate or merely the byproduct of Necron teleportation systems. Several Inquisitors argue that Trazyn exploits these disturbances to confuse Xenos tracking augurs. Others argue that the disturbances precede him, implying he may be following patterns of instability rather than creating them. One particularly detailed Ordo Xenos record describes an incident involving a regiment of Imperial Guard caught inside a collapsing shrine city on the world of Halcyon III. During an evacuation, multiple survivors reported encountering a figure made of phosphor-lit metal, observing the chaos with what appeared to be evaluative interest rather than strategic intent. When the shrine's central reliquary shattered, the figure stepped through the falling debris and retrieved the fragment of a burnt ceremonial tablet, ignoring all combatants. Those who witnessed the event described the movement as perfectly steady, unaffected by environmental destruction, and lacking any urgency. Attempts by the regiment's Tempestus officers to fire upon the figure resulted in the disassembly of their weapons through non-thermal dissociation, suggesting the presence of a defensive field incompatible with known Imperium schematics. The figure left the battlefield without retaliation, leaving behind only the impression that the Guard themselves were irrelevant unless they obstructed the acquisition of the relic. Later comparison with other events allowed the Inquisition to confidently identify the figure as Trazyn. This observational indifference is one of the most consistently documented behavioral traits. Trazyn does not appear to view organic species as competitors, enemies, or obstacles in a conventional sense. Rather, he views them as temporary environmental features, background participants in a much longer sequence. This detachment causes significant strategic confusion. The Inquisition expects a xenos to exhibit patterns of hostility, resource acquisition, territorial expansion, or ideological purpose. Trazyn exhibits none of these. Instead, he exhibits consistency only in his interest in historically charged entities and objects, a category defined by factors that remain unclear to Imperial analysts. Unexplainable findings begin to accumulate once the Inquisition attempts to map Trazyn's activities chronologically. Multiple sealed Chronos reports note that Trazyn's appearances do not align cleanly with the flow of Imperial time. There are documented instances where he appears at a site before Imperial forces arrive, despite records confirming he was observed at a separate event occurring light years away during the same temporal window. This led to early speculation about multiple Trazyn constructs, but the theory was dismissed when forensic comparison of holofeeds showed identical micro-etching patterns on his metallic surface in both appearances. Later perspectives suggest that Trazyn's mastery of stasis fields, displacement matrices, and temporal insulation technologies allows him to manage time differently than organic species. The Inquisition stops short of labeling these abilities as direct time manipulation. Instead, they describe them as temporal non-compliance, meaning that Trazyn operates on a chronometric pathway that intersects with Imperial chronology only when he chooses. An Ordo Malleus subcell encountered an even more concerning anomaly during an investigation into warp bleed on the world of Aresthia. The task force discovered a structure resembling a museum hall, arranged in precise geometric patterns. Each alcove held preserved items, creatures and individuals frozen in stasis. Most were recognizable: Imperial artifacts, Eldar remnants, Tau technology, and even prehistoric fauna. Yet several contained entities that did not match any recorded biological taxonomy. The frozen creatures possessed anatomical features inconsistent with the galaxy's known evolutionary patterns, suggesting either drastically divergent alternate histories or species originating from timelines that never stabilized. The Ordo Malleus concluded that these were not the results of warp mutation, as there was no psychically active residue, no warp trace, and no etheric instability in the chamber. Every subject in the hall was perfectly preserved at a non-warp stasis equilibrium. This discovery led the task force to suspect that the collection belonged to Trazyn, even though they found no direct evidence of his presence. The idea that he collects specimens from timelines that diverge from the Imperium's own is a hypothesis the Inquisition refuses to officially confirm, but continues to track heavily. Further complications arise from Inquisition attempts to surveil Trazyn's movements directly. Augur drones, cloaked servitor intelligences, and Emperor-blessed observation constructs often return corrupted, fragmented, or paradoxical data. A standard report pattern emerges. Multiple drones observe Trazyn from different angles, each recording slightly different versions of his movements. In one notable example, 4 surveillance augurs recorded him standing in 4 different positions simultaneously, all within the same chamber, each version examining a different artifact. When the chamber was later analysed via recon feed, only a single instance of Trazyn was present. This inconsistency suggests that his presence cannot always be captured as a single, coherent event in real time. Whether this is due to Necron cloaking systems, temporal displacement shielding, or a reality layering effect associated with Solemnace's unique environmental properties remains unproven. The Inquisition's emotional responses to Trazyn vary depending on the Ordo. The Ordo Xenos views him as an unpredictable acquisition-oriented force with minimal hostility but immense potential impact. They treat him as a disturbance to historical integrity, one capable of extracting key individuals or objects from crucial events, potentially altering the Imperium's ability to reconstruct its own past. The Ordo Hereticus views him with wariness centered on knowledge control. They express concern that Trazyn possesses archives of Imperial history unavailable even to the High Lords of Terror. This imbalance threatens the Imperium's monopoly on historical narrative. Reports speculate that Trazyn may possess original pre-heresy texts, forbidden Dark Age artifacts, unaltered Mechanicum records, and documents documenting the Emperor's earliest campaigns. Whether he studies these directly or keeps them for reasons unrelated to information value is unknown. The Hereticus conclaves repeatedly note that one who controls the past controls the decisions of the present, and Trazyn's control appears nearly absolute within his domain. The Order Malleus response is far more severe. They do not simply fear Trazyn's knowledge, they fear his silence. The Warp's aversion to Necron technology is well known, but Malleus field teams report that areas associated with Trazyn exhibit an even deeper absence of Warp behaviour. Demons have difficulty manifesting near objects known to have passed through his possession. Psykers report numbness, clarity, or disorienting stillness, as though their connection to the Warp is being gradually unthreaded. In 2 sealed reports, demon hosts referred to Trazyn's collections as void galleries, places where the Warp cannot find purchase, places it actively avoids. That a demon could fear a museum is an observation the Malleus archivists find difficult to contextualize. Unexplainable findings accumulate most clearly when studying the aftermath of Trazyn's departures. Across dozens of worlds, Inquisitors report discovering subtly altered landscapes, structures repositioned for aesthetic symmetry, and relics arranged according to principles unknown to Imperial scholars. These rearrangements are not harmful, they are intentional. They follow patterns consistent across multiple planets, suggesting a curatorial hand shaping each environment. A chapel's shattered statues might be reassembled with seamless precision. A battlefield's debris might be reorganized into rows. Fossil remains might be placed into chronological stacks. These interventions are never destructive, but they are invasive. They indicate a being who sees culture, event, and mortality as manipulable elements within a larger archival project. The Inquisition does not accuse Trazyn of altering timelines directly. They simply note that his influence changes the interpretive landscape of history. By removing an object from its context, he changes the meaning of the event. By preserving a figure that would otherwise die, he changes the narrative of a battle. By choosing which elements of history survive, he performs an act of authorship that no external authority can counteract. Across the 3 Ordos, the consolidated impression builds into a single, unsettling conclusion. Trazyn the Infinite is not an enemy of the Imperium, nor is he an ally. He is an archivist of reality, acting according to a logic that predates the Imperium and will likely outlast it. He is uninterested in domination, disinterested in destruction, and immune to coercion. He cannot be bargained with, predicted, tricked, or intimidated. He acts with patience over spans of time that invalidate human strategy. And above all else, he does not consider the Inquisition worthy of fear. He considers it a source of historical material. In the final classification notes for this section, 3 concise observations appear throughout sealed inquisitorial documents. He takes what the galaxy forgets. He preserves what the galaxy fails to understand, and he always arrives before the galaxy notices what is missing. The anomalies associated with Trazyn the Infinite cannot be categorized by any single Ordo, despite repeated attempts to construct a unified investigative framework. Every cross-reference effort fails in the same pattern. The compiled data forms a coherent structure for several pages before collapsing into contradiction, redaction, or unexplained gaps. This behavior is not caused by corruption, tampering, or warp interference. Instead, the investigative record itself behaves as though the events surrounding Trazyn resist conventional chronology. Reports appear out of expected sequence. Witness testimonies contradict timestamp logs while aligning perfectly with one another's sensory details. Recovered artifacts display signs of having existed in locations before they were recorded as discovered. For the Inquisition, these irregularities create an uncomfortable truth. Interactions with Trazyn alter the investigative environment as much as the battlefield environment. The earliest confirmed anomaly tied to Trazyn originates from a sealed Ordo Xenos survey conducted on the dead world of Myrital 4. The world had been declared lifeless for centuries following an unknown extinction event attributed to atmospheric collapse. However, deep in the irradiated plates of the equatorial vaults, investigators discovered a subterranean structure entirely untouched by geological decay. The architecture matched no human, Eldar or Tau design, nor did it conform to known Orc fortification patterns. Instead, it displayed geometric perfection, repeating hexagonal inlays, metallic surfaces immune to erosion, and an arrangement of galleries that resembled a chronological sequence rather than a spatial one. Each chamber held a preserved subject or object, fossilized fauna, collapsed armor sets, shattered banners, and several stasis-locked warriors of species unknown to the Imperium. Analysis of the field logs shows a disturbing detail. Among the preserved specimens was a single Imperial guardsman, locked in stasis, wearing armor plates bearing the insignia of a regiment not founded until 5 centuries after the vault was originally sealed. Genetic analysis confirmed the guardsman had not travelled through the warp, nor was there any trace of temporal distortion on his person. This discovery remains classified at the highest level. The simplest explanation, and the one least acceptable to the Inquisition, is that Trazyn placed the guardsman in the vault before the regiment existed. The more complex explanation involves a form of historical compression, in which events from different eras are curated into proximity by a force that does not consider linear time binding. Inquisition scholars attempted to contact the relevant guard command to determine whether the soldier was missing from a known conflict. Before they could, the stasis chamber in which he was held activated, and the guardsman vanished through a translocation aperture. The vault's entire gallery dimmed afterward, and several additional specimens were missing. Surveillance feeds captured a final moment, a metallic silhouette in the distance, briefly illuminated by the dimming energy coils. The subject made no aggressive move, no attempt to conceal itself, and no apparent acknowledgement of observers. Its posture was identical to known recordings of Trazyn. The vault collapsed 2 hours later in a seismic event that was not predicted by geological assessment nor detected by deep scan augers. Investigators suspect the collapse was intentional, intended not to destroy evidence, but to close an exhibit no longer relevant. In a later series of encounters, the Inquisition documented a pattern of temporal misalignment occurring during Trazyn's interventions in active war zones. One of the most heavily analysed cases involves the Siege of Foros Reach, a conflict between Imperial forces and a splinter of Hive Fleet Jormungandr. During the early stages of the siege, Imperial commanders reported several inexplicable energy surges accompanied by localised gravity distortion. Imperial tacticians initially suspected a new tyrannid bioform capable of manipulating the battlefield on a macro scale. However, multiple Vox recordings captured a subtle metallic resonance underlying the gravitational pulses, leading Ordo-Xenos to suspect Necron involvement. During a feast day bombardment in the city centre, a Titan-class biological organism broke through Imperial lines and threatened to overrun a cathedral scholar housing civilian survivors. Before Imperial reserves could mobilise, a turquoise flash appeared in the organism's path, followed by the sudden emergence of a phalanx of metallic constructs. These constructs did not engage the tyrannid. Instead, they surrounded a cluster of cracked marble statues within the cathedral, ignoring both the civilians and the advancing bioform. Witnesses described the constructs as moving like archivists retrieving damaged shelving rather than soldiers clearing a battlefield. When the statues were secured, the constructs shimmered out of existence, leaving behind a confused regiment and a tyrannid organism that abruptly shifted direction, apparently unaware of the construct's presence. What makes the Siege of Foros Reach particularly anomalous is a report logged by a junior astropath during the evacuation phase. According to her deposition, she sensed a presence within the cathedral minutes before the constructs appeared. A consciousness devoid of warp signature, yet structured, ordered, and inquisitive. It did not communicate, it observed, and it left behind an impression she described as a question lingering without language. Her report was initially dismissed as the product of stress, but later review compared her sensory description to the psychic impressions recorded during encounters with Necron cryptex. The similarity was precise. Trazyn's involvement in the siege is thus considered confirmed. One of the most troubling anomalies associated with Trazyn involves the phenomenon the Inquisition now refers to as curator parallax. This term describes the repeated observation of multiple versions of Trazyn appearing concurrently within the same event. Though the Inquisition understands these to be hyperface phylacteries or surrogate constructs under Trazyn's control, the phenomenon causes significant investigative problems. When two or more Trazyn proxies appear, they do not mirror one another. Each observes different objects or interacts with different elements of the battlefield. In one documented encounter, a strike team attempting to intercept Trazyn near the ruins of Kel's Rift reported seeing 3 separate versions of him. One stood examining a rusted fragment of an Imperial flight panel. Another observed the strike team without interference. The third engaged an unseen target in the distance using arcane energy pulses. When Mechanicus Magi attempted to triangulate which version was the primary entity, all 3 signatures presented identical quantum alignment patterns. The team withdrew, rather than risk destabilizing the ruin's chronometric field. Upon re-entry 10 minutes later, the ruin had changed. Certain walls had been repositioned, collapse supports restored, and the flight panel was missing. Analysts noted the changes corresponded to Trazyn's typical curatorial preferences. The Mechanicus machine priests involved in the encounter received sealed censure orders, and the area was designated a time-locked zone pending further study. The Inquisition maintains several sealed reports regarding encounters with Trazyn that remain classified not because they are dangerous, but because they defy categorization. One such report describes a confrontation between Trazyn and a radical splinter of the Ordo Xenos attempting to acquire a Necron artifact in violation of standing protocols. The splinter cell cornered Trazyn within the ruins of a pre-Imperial observatory, intending to force him into relinquishing the device. The cell deployed null fields, gravimetric anchors, psych disruptors, and mechanized kill sentries, all measures specifically approved for Necron containment. According to the report, Trazyn did not resist, retaliate, or attempt to escape. Instead, he engaged in what the Inquisitor described as an exchange, though the report does not specify the nature of this interaction. The Inquisitor's journal, recovered later, mentions only that Trazyn offered the group an object of equivalent narrative value. The report ends with a single disturbing detail. The artifact the splinter cell recovered was authentic, but it belonged to an era 40,000 years older than the object they intended to seize. It was an artifact from before humanity had learned to shape metal. The splinter cell later vanished in a classified purge action, and the observatory ruins were quarantined. Another sealed incident involves an Ordo Malleus operative embedded in a Crusade fleet tasked with purging a demon-infested asteroid cluster. During the second phase of the operation, the operative encountered a chamber deep within the cluster, featuring a layout identical to segments of Trazyn's museum halls, even though no Necron presence had been detected in the system. The chamber contained a preserved warp entity, frozen in an inert state. It appeared suspended mid-scream, its flesh twisting with frozen immaterial residue. The entity displayed no psychic activity, and attempts to interact with it resulted in null readings across all scans. The operative concluded that the entity had been forcibly removed from the warp between moments, an act considered impossible under current Imperium understanding. Minutes after the discovery, the chamber destabilized and collapsed into a glass-smooth crater. Surveillance later detected a Necron translocation flash in the asteroid's upper layers, though no direct sighting of Trazyn occurred. The Inquisition also maintained sealed testimonies from several planetary governors who reported brief but unmistakable contact with Trazyn during evacuation protocols. In these accounts, Trazyn appeared not as a hostile force but as a detached observer evaluating the planet's condition. In one testimony, the governor describes Trazyn surveying a burning archive block with what appeared to be interest rather than concern or opportunism. When asked why he was present, Trazyn replied with a phrase that remains under seal but is partially referenced in margin notes: "Preservation beyond your span." What he preserved on that world remains unknown. A particularly unsettling sealed record originates from an Ordo Kronos team dispatched to investigate a divergent timeline echo detected in the Outer Rim. These echoes occasionally appear when the warp destabilizes the barrier between potential histories. Upon reaching the location, the Kronos team found fragments of a timeline that never occurred. Battlefield remains of soldiers in armor patterns, not recognized by any Imperial design, banners featuring unknown heraldry, and stasis relics belonging to forces with no historical footprint. The Kronos team concluded this was an incomplete timeline collapse, a divergent reality that had failed to stabilize and was dissolving into non-existence. At the center of the temporal anomaly, they found a single figure, Trazyn, observing the collapse. He did not engage the team, nor did he attempt to conceal his activity. Instead, he retrieved several relics from the evaporating timeline, storing them in his dimensional coils as if they were mere artifacts from an archaeological dig. When questioned, he responded with a statement recorded in fragmented vox. Events exist only if curated. The team filed their report under highest seal and was disbanded shortly afterward. One of the most heavily redacted entries concerns an incident within the Pale Concourse on Terror itself. This event remains controversial, as any Necron presence within the throne world is considered impossible. Yet the sealed report contains a brief reference to a metallic figure observed in the reflection of a reliquary mirror, accompanied by a note that the figure was identical in silhouette to Trazyn's known form. No physical trace was found, and custodian guard patrols detected nothing. The report may be a misinterpretation. However, the Inquisition keeps it under lock not because it is confirmed, but because it is not entirely dismissed. As the Inquisition accumulates these sealed accounts, a singular pattern emerges. Trazyn does not intervene in history. He retrieves pieces of it. He navigates events with the same detachment a scholar brings to ancient ruins. Yet unlike a scholar, he's not limited by decay, time, or loss. Where the Imperium struggles to retain knowledge against entropy, Trazyn preserves it effortlessly. The Imperium fears what he collects, but it fears more what he chooses not to. In the concluding pages of the Ordo's sealed archives, there is a phrase repeated across different centuries by unrelated investigators. History is not safe, it is being curated, and Trazyn the Infinite is the one doing the curating. The Inquisition maintains multiple layers of classification regarding Trazyn the Infinite, spanning across Ordo Xenos, Ordo Hereticus, Ordo Malleus, and Ordo Kronos. The documents, collectively labelled under high-tier clearance codes, summarize direct encounters, inferred motivations, and unexplainable phenomena attributed to the Necron dynasty. Access is strictly restricted, with only select senior inquisitors permitted to synthesize data for operational planning or threat assessment. The files reveal that Trazyn is not categorized as hostile in the conventional sense. Instead, he is understood as an agent whose actions exist outside the Imperium's moral, strategic, and temporal frameworks. The earliest classified memoranda describe Trazyn as a curatorial anomaly. Field agents consistently report that he collects artifacts, individuals, and specimens with historical significance, often removing them from the context in which they were recorded. The process is neither destructive nor violent unless incidental to retrieval. Rather, it is highly selective, precise, and aligned with criteria that remain entirely opaque to the Imperium. In multiple cases, agents observed that objects removed by Trazyn were otherwise doomed to destruction or obliteration due to warfare, decay, or environmental collapse. The Inquisition interprets this as a form of preservation that operates on a scale both galactic and temporal, fundamentally unlike any strategy employed by the Adeptus Mechanicus or any recorded human archival initiative. Reports indicate that Trazyn's interventions frequently generate systemic anomalies that disrupt Imperial operations. Surveillance devices fail or report conflicting data. Psychers experience unexpected sensory dissonance. Augmentic constructs record temporal paradoxes, and entire local timelines appear to warp or overlap in ways that defy standard chronometric models. Classified Order Kronos files repeatedly refer to these occurrences as temporal non-compliance, a phenomenon wherein Trazyn's presence effectively resists fixed chronological mapping. Attempts to track, confine, or replicate his methods have consistently failed, with all experiments yielding either null results or contradictory data. This non-compliance is documented as an intrinsic property of Trazyn's operations, rather than a byproduct of external interference. Several highly restricted reports describe encounters in which Trazyn's presence directly alters perceptions of reality. One memorandum from a joint Ordo-Xenos-Ordo-Kronos task force records the recovery of multiple stasis chambers containing living and extinct species, including figures whose genetic markers match no known timeline or established population. Individuals are frozen mid-action or mid-gesture, often in scenes consistent with conflicts or ceremonies, never otherwise recorded in the Imperium's historical logs. Investigators attempted to access these specimens for study, but were impeded by automated Necron defense measures and localized temporal flux, both of which appear designed to prevent direct interference. The files describe the experience as observation only. Interaction results in systemic nullification. Another recurring theme in the classified archives is Trazyn's capacity to manage multiple parallel manifestations of himself during a single event. Field reports document instances of 2, 3, or more distinct figures, each performing unique observational actions within the same spatial coordinates. Mechanicus analysis identifies identical quantum resonance patterns across all manifestations, confirming that they are not separate entities but projections or hyperphase surrogates under Trazyn's control. These projections complicate both tactical assessment and data recording, as agents are unable to establish definitive chronology, intent, or causality during these events. The Inquisition has formally classified these occurrences under curator parallax and treats them as non-combative but strategically disruptive. Sealed memoranda also document instances in which Trazyn's presence directly influences psychic stability. Areas he occupies, or in which he has conducted curation, exhibit what is described as warp attenuation. Psychers experience diminished connection to the warp, demons encounter resistance to manifestation, and psychic echoes are fragmented or nullified entirely. Ordo Malleus reports suggest that this effect is not absolute, but significant enough to suppress demon activity within range of preserved artifacts. Multiple entries highlight that Trazyn's collection may function as a containment lattice, isolating and stabilizing entities and events that would otherwise generate chaos in the material or immaterial planes. The significance of this is noted, but its mechanism remains unproven. In addition to field encounters, the Inquisition maintains several sealed intelligence files recovered from rogue scholars, planetary governors, and Mechanicus operatives. One notable case describes a governor's unexpected interaction with Trazyn during the aftermath of a planetary uprising. The governor reported that Trazyn examined destroyed archival facilities, catalogued ruined texts and artifacts, and retrieved several specimens without attempting to engage in the conflict. When questioned about the purpose, Trazyn allegedly stated, "Preservation requires no consent, it requires only selection." The Inquisition regards this as a succinct expression of Trazyn's operational principle. He is not governed by morality, strategy, or allegiance, but by curation, preservation, and historical priority. Another classified case involves a sealed Ordo-Xenos report of a battle between a splinter Xenos force and Imperial defenders. Trazyn appeared in multiple locations simultaneously, retrieving artifacts and intervening indirectly. When agents attempted direct engagement, he exercised non-lethal countermeasures that rendered Imperial weaponry ineffective. No hostiles were neutralized, no civilians harmed, and yet the Imperium's tactical footprint was entirely circumvented. Analysts note that these actions exemplify Trazyn's consistent behavioral model. He intervenes only to preserve or extract, never to dominate or destroy. The Inquisition's evaluation emphasizes the broader implications of Trazyn's activities. His curated collections frequently include individuals, technologies, and relics from eras lost to Imperial records. By retaining these materials, he possesses historical insight that exceeds even the High Lord's repositories. Several classified intelligence bulletins speculate that Trazyn may have access to knowledge of the Emperor's early campaigns, pre-heresy Mechanicum secrets, and even records from extinct Xenos civilizations. Whether he utilizes this knowledge to manipulate outcomes, preserve context, or simply catalogue remains unconfirmed. Analysts caution that the act of curation alone grants him strategic advantage over entities dependent on continuity and historical awareness. Repeated field analysis also identifies that Trazyn's interventions often leave post-event environments altered in subtle ways. Urban ruins are reorganized according to patterns reflecting symmetry, narrative coherence, or aesthetic curation. Battlefield detritus may be rearranged to preserve the positions of key combatants or to document significant interactions. Fossilized remains are sometimes repositioned chronologically. These interventions do not hinder survival or recovery. They merely reflect Trazyn's compulsion to structure reality in accordance with archival principles. The Inquisition describes this as non-destructive manipulation of contextual reality, a phenomenon that challenges existing frameworks of causality and material permanence. From a consolidated Inquisition perspective, Trazyn the Infinite is not an immediate threat to the Imperium, but he represents a fundamental disruption to its control over knowledge, history, and temporal perception. He operates outside standard definitions of allegiance, hostility, or diplomacy. He is capable of accessing multiple timelines, preserving or removing critical artifacts, neutralizing psychic and technological threats without harm, and creating curated environments resistant to Imperial or xenos interference. Every interaction demonstrates that his motivations are neither predictable nor negotiable. His long-term presence may pose a strategic vulnerability to the Imperium not through destruction, but through the selective preservation of knowledge and the alteration of historical context. The Inquisition concludes its analysis by reiterating that Trazyn's activities cannot be prevented, redirected, or fully observed. Every encounter confirms the operative principle that he functions according to his own archival logic. In practical terms, this means that while Trazyn may occasionally act in alignment with Imperial interests, he cannot be relied upon as an agent or ally. Conversely, he does not pursue active campaigns of aggression or conquest in a conventional sense. The documents consistently warn that his influence manifests primarily in the curation of events and the alteration of historical context, a factor the Imperium cannot reverse once he has acted. The final remark in the highest tier classification reads, "Trazyn the Infinite is beyond containment, beyond negotiation, and beyond conventional threat assessment. His preservationist imperatives ensure the survival of what the Imperium has lost or forgotten, while simultaneously altering the interpretive framework of history itself." In every encounter, Trazyn demonstrates mastery over the temporal, material, and psychic domains, operating as an archivist whose understanding of the galaxy surpasses that of the Imperium itself. The Inquisition may monitor, document, and seal reports, but it cannot dictate the terms of his collection. In essence, Trazyn the Infinite is a being of observation, curation, and permanence. The Imperium observes only the margins of his activity, while he maintains control of the historical record in a manner entirely his own. The Inquisition's final classified files collectively assert that Trazyn's presence constitutes an ongoing anomaly, one whose implications cannot yet be fully determined, but whose influence is undeniable. The Imperium may attempt to understand, but it cannot command, prevent, or fully interpret the actions of Trazyn the Infinite.